I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. My title today is Zelensky Howls at the NATO moon, but neither are within reach. Since the U.S. blew up the Nord Streams, something that, unlike James Corbett, I take as fact, I haven't put out another episode on Ukraine. And that's not because things aren't still happening there, but mainly because things aren't changing. That there are new revelations and there are new confirmations of the information, but pretty much we knew everything going into this that is still true today. So in this episode, I'm going to look at some new information from Aaron Mate, Scott Ritter, Moon of Alabama, and the Vilnius NATO Summit. But I'm also going to link my previous 10 episodes on Ukraine and Russia, on Zelensky, Putin, Victoria Nuland, Sergei Glazyev, and all of the things like the question of, is Ukraine and the Great Reset both answering to the same master? A question I still haven't really solved. So let's look at what's happening right now, and then let's look at the retrospective, which unfortunately is all still relevant. Let's start with Scott Ritter and his new documentary on Agent Zelensky. This is very watchable. It puts all of this history into a context and a narrative that includes a lot of maps and visuals that make it, I think, a good start for someone who doesn't have a lot of the background, and also a great refresher for those of us who have been following. This uses some of the things like talking about Kolomoisky and the Pandora Papers, which I talked about back over a year ago in my The West versus the Rest. But he also adds a lot of details about all of the real estate holdings that Zelensky has around the world, including a mansion in Crimea. And that, I think, will come into play a little bit later. He also has some tantalizing details about a UK connection with their intelligence and also the Vatican. So it's definitely something that is worth watching and is also enjoyable and easy to watch. In a written format, there is Brad, who I found on Aaron Mate's comment thread, and he does Euphoric Recall. He has the same kind of history that is in a very logically connected and organized and nicely laid out way to be another way of keeping up on this following narrative. And then he also has one that I recommend that people watch called A Sad Soul Can Kill You Quicker Than a Germ. This is on the lockdowns, on the addictions and the overdoses, the suicides, and I'm really happy that he's keeping that from being forgotten. It really brought that time back to me, and he tells a very heartbreaking and poignant personal story with it. So I recommend checking that out too, and the links are all in Substack. And then there is Robert Orwell Hand, who has a series on capitalism, democracy, and the American empire. In part 5, he really connects the dots of looking at how NATO has surrounded Russia and looking at why it is that you can't negotiate with an empire. So those are all things that I think are worth looking at. Zelensky's Crimean mansion adds new sinister overtones to Aaron Mate's new article called Shunning Diplomacy, Ukraine Plans to Take Crimea Hostage. He writes, the prevailing disregard for Ukraine's security needs and survival can be seen today in the unfolding counteroffensive. The West has pushed Ukraine into an assault despite a rushed training schedule, a lack of air superiority, and facing well-entrenched Russian positions. In a recent interview, Ukraine's chief military officer, Valery Zaluzhny, openly complained, Without being fully supplied, these plans are not at all feasible. Zelensky also dispelled the notion, pushed avidly by U.S. neoconservatives, that last month's short-lived Wagner rebellion created a military opening for Ukraine. "We didn't feel that their defense got weaker somewhere or anything," Zelensky said. The U.S. response is now to send more weapon systems than had been previously ruled out, namely indiscriminate cluster munitions and escalation-threatening long-range missiles. For his part, Zelensky appears desperate to appease his NATO sponsors in advance of next week's NATO meeting in Lithuania. "Before the NATO summit, we have to show results, but every kilometer costs lives," he recently explained. And now those results will apparently come by attempting to take millions of Crimeans hostage, as the one-time president of peace continues along the Western-driven path of prolonged war. So that Lithuanian NATO summit has now happened as the Vilnius summit, and Emmanuel Pastrik has published this communiqué that welcomes Finland and Sweden as full members, confirms its open-door policy, and keeps Ukraine outside that door, begging to come in. Here is the curiously worded number 6 of that communiqué. "Strategic competition, pervasive instability, and recurrent shocks define our broader security environment. Conflict, fragility, and instability in Africa and the Middle East directly affect our security and the security of our partners. The People's Republic of China stated ambitions and coercive policies challenge our interest, security, and values. We remain open to constructive engagement with the PRC, including to build reciprocal transparency, with a view to safeguarding the alliance's security interest. We continue to be confronted by cyber, space, hybrid, and other asymmetrical threats, and by the malicious use of emerging and disruptive technologies." So Africa and the Middle East, while not NATO members, affect the security of our partners. I think that should be Partners, Inc. And it's only asymmetry in one direction to have all of the countries in the world aligned against Russia and China. It continues. "We are committed to achieving a just and lasting peace that upholds the principles of the UN Charter. This cannot be realized without Russia's complete and unconditional withdrawal. While we have called on Russia to engage constructively in credible negotiations with Ukraine, Russia has not shown any genuine openness to a just and lasting peace." And 19, NATO does not seek confrontation and poses no threat to Russia. In light of its hostile policies and actions, we cannot consider Russia to be our partner. And for a different perspective on that, this is from an open comment thread from Moon of Alabama, and it's someone named B who contributed this way back in January. He writes, "The stocks of 2 complete armies have by now been destroyed in Ukraine. The resources for a smaller third one will be delivered in the next rounds of Western equipment deliveries during the next months. Russia will duly destroy Ukraine's third army just as it has destroyed the first and second one. It is doubtful that the West has enough material left to provide Ukraine with a fourth one. That then leaves only 2 options: send in Western armies with the equipment they still have, or declare victory and go home. The West is failing to grasp the reality that Russia believes it is winning the war in Ukraine and that it is not suffering economic or political damage at home. And when you factor in the international arena, the war has proven to be a boon for Russia's efforts to help create a new international financial trade system that circumvents Washington's control. In other words, Russia has little incentive to entertain negotiations that would require Russian concessions. And at some point in the future, I'll be following up on that part of it and the de-dollarization aspect. So to catch up, here are the summaries of my 10 previous episodes on Ukraine and Russia, and starts with the most recent. Nord Streams and the Bagel of Doom. Connects the Seymour Hersh bombshell story about Biden blowing up the Nord Streams with Michael Hudson's article from a year prior, America Defeats Germany for the Third Time in a Century. Is the bomb train in East Palestine, Ohio, connected to the bomb cyclone in Northern California and the freak lightning that sparked dozens of fires in a night? I ask if there's a 3D reset of depopulation, dispossession, and destruction, and at this point I've added 4D for deception. And I conclude with the movie, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. Then, the reset and Ukraine, same or different masters. As the bill for the proxy war reaches $105 billion, Aaron Mate writes about Their Blood, Our Bullets, and Glenn Greenwald shows how the media rewrites Ukraine's dark history. Zelensky is presented as the second coming of Winston Churchill, but they don't mean Churchill's prolonging of World War II, so Russia and Germany would bleed each other dry. I quote David Zweig on the Twitter COVID dump and Jimmy Dore on right-left politics. Jeff Childers asks if there's already one world government, and I end with Matt Ehret on China and Russia's multipolar alternatives and Jessica Rose on thinking for ourselves. Russia, a wrench in the reset gears. Is Putin a part of the Great Reset or an unintended consequence of sanctions gone awry? I take a closer look at the economic policies in Putin's St. Petersburg address. Inflation protection for pensioners and families, state support for mothers, low-interest infrastructure loans, reduced expense and bureaucracy for entrepreneurs, and eco-friendly tourism with environmental restoration. He tasks regional governments with increasing self-employment and home ownership, and admonishes large business owners that a good name will mean more to their heirs than money and property. And I give Sergei Glazyev a lot of credit because I think he's behind that domestic policy. Ukraine, the hegemon's last stand. On Sputnik Radio's Fault Lines, Jamarl Thomas asks, is Ukraine the hegemon's last stand? Matching the title I'd already drafted. He cites that Putin has already surrounded the Donbass with 1,700 Ukrainian troops surrendering. His co-host, Manila Chan, quotes Rand Paul that the U.S. needs to borrow from China the money to give Ukraine, and beg Saudi Arabia for the oil to give the EU. Meanwhile, the Summit of the Americas is an embarrassment, with Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua banned and others not bothering to attend. Caitlin Johnstone supplies stats on how many years of proven oil reserves are left. 1,500 plus for Venezuela, 300 plus for Libya, 200 plus for Iran, and 11 for the United States, which is better than Europe with none. I end with a strategy for what we want when this house of cards falls. Microcurrencies that give us control over our properties and labor, and I imagine how that could look. The West versus the rest. What I learned this week. Aaron Mate on U.S. arming terrorists in Syria, Kanikoa on the Ukrainian oligarch funding Hunter Biden, Zelensky and Azov, Moon of Alabama on Russia entering Phase 2, Scott Ritter on Russian strategy and false flags, Pepe Escobar interviewing Putin's economic czar Sergei Glazyev on the new global financial system, and Vijay Prashad on We Don't Want a Divided Planet, We want a world without walls. I end with some hopeful ways in which the empire might be dismantling itself and preparing the ground for a network of small local economies. Then, what Zelensky should keep. I look at what Zelensky should keep, such as his campaign promise and Ukraine's international agreements, and what he should give up. I examine whether Putin has a weapon more powerful than nuclear bombs that he's already detonated. The petro-ruble. In particular, I delve into the intricate funding of the biological labs and their connection to people like Hunter Biden and Jeffrey Epstein. I begin with how Americans are learning to love being lied to, and end by asking if Zelensky has either the power or the incentive to negotiate peace. A correction to the video is that Zelensky is in Kiev, committed to pressing for peace and renewing his plea for countries to send more weapons. Putin peace, petrodollar pain. Adds new info on Ukraine from Aaron Mate, my go-to, the U.S. Peace Council, Scott Ritter, and Michael Hudson. Asked whether there were diplomatic options that Russia could have pursued but didn't. Examines Putin's strategy in having $350 billion of Russian gold in foreign banks subject to seizing and freezing. Was it a trap so he could repudiate the petrodollar? Has the U.S. done him a favor by bankrupting the Russian oligarchs? What does this mean for Germany and France that they'll need to buy oil and gas in the petro-ruble? And how much trickle-down pain will there be when petroleum-based fertilizer factories shut down? Lastly, could this be the catalyst for taking back local economies and making them productive? Yanis Varoufakis is naive on Ukraine. In Russell Brand's interview, Yanis states that we must always support the defenders and the sovereignty of the invaded. I question who the aggressors are, and if Ukraine is a pawn. Sovereignty and the right of secession are discussed, along with whether this is Russia's war or just Putin's, as Yanis claims. I examine the role of Russian oligarch money in the demise of Greece and Cyprus, and quote Yanis from my book, How to Dismantle an Empire. I end with the hope that we're not being played by all sides, comparing them to rats at a chicken feeder. Ukrainian peace and U.S. petropocalypse. What are the Russian terms for Ukrainian peace? Could U.S. economic sanctions on Russia backfire for the petrodollar? These are questions you won't hear discussed in either mainstream or liberal news. After I look at what Matt Taibbi and Caitlin Johnstone got right, I get the scoop on peace negotiations from Tom Ozimek of the Epoch Times, relayed through Robert Malone. Greg Palast reports on how billionaires picked Putin as Russia's Pinochet, and Pepe Escobar quotes Michael Hudson in Say Hello to Russian Gold and Chinese Petro-Yuan. Ends with socio-spiritual advice to enjoy the ride because we're about to enter the rapids. And then the very first one that I did, which I think is still my cleverest, Escape from Azkaban, Victoria Nuland and Ukraine. Ukraine is the latest victim of the Harry Potter villain Dolores Umbridge, back from Azkaban where she was sent for crimes against humanity, aka Muggles. She's now disguised as Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland and wreaking havoc from NATO to Iraq, Afghanistan to Libya, Syria to the Iron Maidan of Ukraine. I examine false flag, Dementor, sniper attacks, Horcruxes as WMDs, and Voldemort as World Death. I explain the relevance of the NATO agreement, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the Budapest Memorandum. I end with a lesson from a 1947 Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, Dorothy L. Sayre, on why whole classes and nations are hypnotized by the arts of the spellbinder, because we don't know how to decipher words and use logic to resist propaganda. To follow up, here is Escape from Azkaban, and here is the playlist on geopolitics and Ukraine that will have all of those episodes, and all of them will be linked individually in the Substack. Thank you for watching.